My daughter looked at me across that restaurant table, smiled the way she always does when she wants something, and told me that her mother-in-law, Pauline Hurst, had generously offered to help plan her 40th birthday party. And could I please not make it awkward? Not make it awkward. Those were the exact words my daughter Joanna used. The same daughter I raised alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Sudbury for 18 years. The same daughter who used to fall asleep on my lap during thunderstorms. The same daughter I worked double shifts at the hospital laundry for every winter, so she could take piano lessons on Saturday mornings. I'm Harriet Oakes. I'm 63 years old. And until about 14 months ago, I genuinely believed the hardest part of my life was already behind me. My husband Leonard died when Joanna was 11. A cardiac event, the doctor called it, as if giving it a clinical name might make it easier to carry. It didn't. Leonard was 44 years old, and he was the kindest man I've ever known. He coached Joanna's soccer team even though he knew nothing about soccer. He drove me to every nursing shift when our car was being repaired, then took the bus home alone at 2 a.m. without once complaining. When he died, I sat in the parking lot of the hospital where he'd been treated for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home and to tell Joanna. We didn't have much after Leonard passed. His life insurance covered the funeral and 2 months of rent. I went back to work full-time within the week. There wasn't a choice. Joanna was young, and she needed stability, so I gave her the only kind I could offer, which was showing up. Every morning, every evening, every parent-teacher night, every school play, every heartbreak. She was a good kid. Curious and funny and occasionally too stubborn for her own good, which she got from Leonard. I always told her. She did well in school, earned herself a scholarship to Lakehead, became a social worker. The day she graduated, I cried so hard that the woman sitting next to me passed me a full pack of tissues without being asked. After she moved to Thunder Bay for work, we talked on the phone every Sunday. That was our arrangement. She called at 10. I made tea. We talked for an hour, sometimes 2. It was one of the things I looked forward to most each week. A small thing to some people. Not to me. The change started after she met her husband, Warren Hurst. Warren is not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He's pleasant and well-dressed, and very attentive to Joanna in public. He remembers to hold doors and say thank you to servers. But he grew up wealthy, in a way that shaped him in ways he doesn't fully see. His family owns commercial property in Thunder Bay and Sault Ste. Marie. His mother, Pauline Hurst, sits on 2 charity boards and takes annual trips to Portugal. She drives a car that costs more than I made in 3 years at my best salary. When Joanna first told me about Warren, her voice had that particular lightness in it, the kind that meant she was trying not to sound too hopeful. I liked that about her, that she'd learned to protect her own heart. I told her to bring him home when she was ready. He came for Thanksgiving. He was polite. He brought a very expensive bottle of wine and complimented my apartment in a way that sounded genuine but probably wasn't. Joanna watched us carefully the whole evening, like she was waiting for something to go wrong. Nothing went wrong. But nothing went right, either. A few months later, I met Pauline Hurst at a dinner Warren organized at a restaurant in Thunder Bay. It was the kind of place with no prices on the menu and lighting so dim I could barely read what I was ordering. Pauline arrived 10 minutes late with the ease of someone who has never worried about making people wait. She shook my hand. "Harriet," she said. Just my first name. Her smile was the sort that reaches the eyes but doesn't quite start there. She asked about Sudbury. Asked what I had done before retirement. When I explained I'd worked in hospital services for most of my career, she nodded in a way that closed the conversation rather than opening it. Her attention moved on like water, finding a lower surface. By the end of the evening, I had learned a great deal about Pauline Hurst. She had strong opinions about where Joanna and Warren should live. She believed young couples needed mentorship from people who understood financial planning. She mentioned twice that Warren's late father had always said family support was everything. Each time she said it, she looked at Warren, not at Joanna. I drove back to Sudbury that night telling myself I was being ungenerous, that I was looking for reasons to distrust her, that I was doing the thing mothers do, the thing that drives adult children away. So I stopped looking. That was my mistake. Over the next year, things shifted in ways I couldn't quite name. Joanna still called on Sundays, but the calls got shorter. 20 minutes. 15. Sometimes she had to cut it short because they were heading to the Hursts for lunch. I said of course, every time. I meant it. But I noticed, at Christmas Warren's family hosted. I was invited, which I appreciated. But when I arrived at Pauline's house, I quickly understood the shape of things. The seating placed me beside Warren's aunt, a woman I'd never met, while Joanna sat with Pauline near the center of the table. The gifts had been arranged by someone, and mine, a hand-knitted throw I'd worked on since October, was set aside with barely a glance. I told myself it was a busy day. I told myself these things happen. Then came Joanna's birthday dinner. She had turned 40 and Warren wanted to make it special. I took the bus from Sudbury because I'd been having some trouble with my knee and didn't want to drive alone in January. I arrived at the restaurant first. When Joanna came in and saw me, she hugged me quickly, and then immediately looked past my shoulder for Warren. It was over dinner that she told me about Pauline's offer to plan the party. A proper celebration, she said. Something at the Hursts' property, with catering and a photographer. Pauline knew people. Pauline had wonderful taste. Pauline thought it would be so lovely, and could I please not make it awkward? I looked at my daughter across that table. She was wearing a blouse I hadn't seen before, probably a gift from Pauline. She looked beautiful. She also looked slightly nervous, the same way she'd looked when she was 16 and asking to stay out past curfew. Certain I would say no. I said of course. I said it sounded wonderful. I picked up my fork and changed the subject, but in the taxi back to my hotel, I sat with my hands in my lap and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger exactly. Something older and quieter. The feeling of becoming invisible to someone you made yourself visible for. I didn't sleep much that night. The following weeks were difficult, in a way I didn't talk about with anyone. I'm a private person. Leonard used to tease me about it. Harriet, you could be drowning and you'd ask if anyone needed a hand. He wasn't wrong. I don't lean easily. It's taken me a long time to understand that's not the same as being strong. I started paying closer attention. Not in a suspicious way, or at least I tried not to. But I noticed things. When I called Joanna on a Sunday and mentioned that my building had raised the rent and I was thinking of moving, she said, "That's too bad, Mom. But I'm sure you'll figure it out." Then asked if I'd seen the documentary about penguins that Pauline had recommended. When I mentioned that my knee had been bothering me more than usual, and the specialist had a long wait list, she said she'd ask Warren if they knew anyone. She never followed up. I noticed that when Pauline spoke, Joanna listened in a different way. More attentive. More eager. The way you listen to someone whose approval you're still trying to earn. I had never seen Joanna like that with anyone. Not even Leonard, who she had adored. About 4 months after the birthday dinner, I was visiting Thunder Bay. Joanna and Warren had a small house by then. I was staying in their guest room, which was also used for Pauline's things apparently, judging by the number of storage boxes along one wall. One evening, Warren had some colleagues over for dinner. I helped Joanna in the kitchen, the way we used to cook together when she was a teenager. It felt easy, like breathing. Toward the end of the night, the guests moved to the living room. I was putting away the last of the dishes when I heard Joanna's voice from around the corner. She was speaking quietly, but my kitchen instincts are good. And the walls in that house are thin. I heard Warren's name. And then Pauline's. Then I heard Joanna laugh in that slightly tight way she does when she's agreeing with something she isn't entirely comfortable with. Then I heard 3 words that stopped my hands. She means well. She means well. She means, said the way you talk about someone who has become a small obligation rather than a person. I stood at that sink for a long moment. I placed the dish towel on the counter very carefully, the way you do when you are trying not to feel the thing you're feeling. Then I heard something else. Warren's voice lower. I couldn't make out much. Then the phrase, commitment to the family's future. Then Joanna, quieter, still. I know that. Then Warren again. Something about what Pauline was building. Something about how certain arrangements made more sense now. Something about me, though he used the word situation rather than my name. I stopped listening. Not because I was being principled about it, because I didn't want to hear what came next. That night I lay in the guest room surrounded by Pauline's boxes and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The next morning I drove home to Sudbury. 3 days later, Warren called me. He was pleasant. He was always pleasant. He mentioned that he and Joanna had been thinking about the future, that they wanted to be thoughtful about estate planning. He said Pauline had a family structure that worked very well, and they were hoping to do something similar. Then he mentioned that it might be helpful for all of us if I were to sign a simple document. A family agreement, he called it. Just a formality. To keep things organized. He emailed it that afternoon. I sat at my kitchen table and read it for a long time. It was not a simple document. It was 15 pages, and buried in Section 7, in language that I had to read 3 times to understand, was a clause that would waive any future interest I might have in certain joint assets, certain property arrangements, certain inheritances that Leonard, my Leonard, had apparently been party to before he died. I put the document down. Then I made myself a cup of tea and sat very still. Leonard had been careful with money, in ways I hadn't fully understood. He worked for a surveying company for many years. He had a quiet mind for detail. He mentioned once, only once, that he'd been involved in a land file with a colleague that might come to something eventually. He said it the way he said most things, without fanfare, as though it was a small note worth keeping. I hadn't thought about it in years. I called my daughter. She answered on the second ring. Her voice had a careful quality to it, the kind of careful that tells you the conversation has already been rehearsed. "Mom, I'm glad you called." I told her I had read the document. I asked her to explain it to me in plain language. There was a pause. "It's just a formality," she said. "Warren's lawyer drafted it. Pauline's whole family has signed something similar." I asked what I would be signing away. Another pause. "It's not really signing anything away. It's more of a clarification. I have been a mother for 40 years. I know the difference between an explanation and a pivot." I told her I would think about it. I told her I loved her, and then I hung up and sat in my kitchen for the better part of an hour doing nothing at all. That evening I found a name in an old address book. Douglas Price. He was a solicitor who had handled Leonard's affairs after he died. Semi-retired now. I still had his number because I had never thrown away anything connected to Leonard. I called him the following morning. He picked up on the 4th ring. When I said my name, there was a pause. Then he said, "Harriet Oakes. I've wondered when I might hear from you." I said, "Douglas, I think I need your help." He said, "I think you might be right." We met the following week. Douglas kept his office in a small building in Sudbury, the kind of place with bookshelves that actually hold books and a coffee maker that sounds like it's working very hard. He hadn't changed much in 20-odd years except for the hair, which had gone fully white. He asked if I remembered a man named Franklin Reeve. I did, vaguely. A business contact of Leonard's. I'd met him twice, maybe 3 times. Quiet man, careful eyes. Douglas set a folder on the desk. Leonard and Franklin Reeve had been involved in a land partnership, he told me. A private arrangement. Commercial property just outside the city, land that had appreciated significantly in the decades since. Leonard had entered the arrangement in the late 90s, before Joanna was born. Before we were married, in fact. He had retained a small but legally documented interest in the partnership. I looked at Douglas. I asked why I had never known. He chose his words carefully. Leonard planned to tell you once certain matters were finalized. He was still organizing the paperwork when he became ill. He believed there would be time. There wasn't. Douglas leaned forward. He passed me another document, older, with Leonard's handwriting in the margin. I recognized his handwriting immediately. It had always been neater than mine. There was an annotation beside one paragraph, a note in Leonard's hand, dated about 6 months before he died. It said, "H knows nothing of this yet. Protect accordingly." I stared at those 5 words for a long time. Douglas gave me the space to do that. Then he said, "There is one more thing, Harriet." I looked up. He slid a second document across the desk. This one was an agreement between Leonard and Franklin Reeve. And on the 3rd page, listed as a secondary party in one of the land transactions, was a name I recognized. Pauline Hurst's late husband, Thomas Hurst. The room became very quiet. I asked Douglas what that meant. He said it meant that the Hurst family had been connected to this property arrangement far longer than I had realized, that Thomas Hurst had been part of an early transaction that benefited from Leonard's partnership share, and that Pauline, as her late husband's estate executor, would have known this. Which meant, That Pauline Hurst had sat across from me at that dim restaurant, shaken my hand, smiled her practiced smile, and said nothing. Not a word. I drove home from Douglas's office and stood in my kitchen for a while. I looked at the photograph of Leonard I keep on the window ledge above the sink, taken at a camping trip north of Manitoulin Island. He's laughing at something I can't remember saying. I said out loud, "You knew something about them, didn't you?" The kitchen didn't answer. But somehow I already knew it had. I told no one. Not for 3 weeks. I continued talking to Joanna on Sundays. Shorter calls now. Careful ones. She asked twice if I had looked at the document again. I said I was still thinking. She accepted this without much pressure, which told me Warren was handling the strategy, and she was handling the relationship, and they had agreed to give me time before the next step. I had seen that arrangement before. Not with them. With patients at the hospital, the ones whose families had decided something on their behalf, and were now waiting politely for the patient to arrive at the same conclusion. Douglas continued working. He contacted Franklin Reeve, who was in his 80s now and living in Elliott Lake. Franklin Reeve, it turned out, had kept everything, every agreement, every letter, every amendment. The kind of man who kept things. When Douglas sent me a summary of what Franklin had provided, I read it 3 times. Leonard's interest in the land partnership was not small. It had never been small. Over the decades, through sales and reinvestment, through appreciation and a commercial development in the early 2000s, it had grown into something significant, something that, legally, had passed to me when Leonard died, and remained mine. The document Warren had sent me was designed to make me give that up. Whether Joanna fully understood that, I still don't know. I want to believe she didn't. But I know Pauline did. Warren organized a dinner, a family dinner he called it, at the Hearst property outside Thunder Bay. A summer evening, he said. Pauline wanted to bring everyone together. He said it warmly, as if togetherness had always been the goal. I accepted. I had already spoken to Douglas. I had already asked him to be available that evening by phone. I had already made certain decisions. I was struck again by its scale. A house built to remind visitors of the distance between them and the people who lived there. Pauline stood at the door. She smiled. "Harriet," she said, as though we were old friends reunited after too long. The dinner was pleasant. Pauline was charming. Warren was attentive. Joanna looked beautiful and a little tired and kept glancing at me sideways in a way I recognized from when she was small and had done something she wasn't sure I knew about yet. After the main course, Pauline suggested we move to the sitting room. Once we were settled, Warren brought out a folder. He placed it on the low table. He said he wanted to revisit the family agreement in a relaxed setting, without any pressure. He said he hoped it would feel like a conversation. He asked if I had had a chance to reconsider. I said I had. I said I had also had a chance to speak with my solicitor, Douglas Price, and to review some documents that Franklin Reeve had been kind enough to provide. The room changed when I said those names. Not dramatically. Pauline's expression didn't collapse. She was too practiced for that, but something shifted behind her eyes. Something quickened. I had seen that look before too, in people who have just realized the room is not arranged the way they thought it was. I told them, quietly, that Leonard's interest in the land partnership had been documented, protected, and legally transferred to me upon his death. I told them that the family agreement Warren had sent me would have waived that interest. I told them that Douglas had been in contact with the appropriate parties, and that formal documentation was already being prepared. Warren said that wasn't his understanding. I said that was the nature of things kept from us. We don't understand them until we do. Pauline said there was obviously some confusion. I looked at her. I said that might be true. I said I was genuinely open to the possibility that her husband had never told her about his connection to Leonard's partnership. I said I hoped that was the case. I waited. She didn't say it was the case. Joanna had gone very still. She was sitting beside Warren on the small settee and she was looking at her hands. Then she looked at me. Her expression was not the one I expected. It wasn't defensive. It was something that looked more like shame. She said quietly, "Mom, did you know about this before tonight?" I said I had only recently found out. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, because I wanted you to see it yourself. The room was quiet for a long time after that. Pauline recovered, the way practiced people do. She suggested they all take some time to review things properly. She used words like misunderstanding and moving forward and fresh eyes. But the confidence had gone out of her. She sounded like someone reading from a script that no longer fit the scene. Warren tried once more. He said there were different interpretations of historical agreements. Douglas could speak to that, I told him. Douglas did, the following week, through the appropriate channels. I won't pretend the next several months were easy. Joanna called me the day after that dinner. She cried, which I didn't expect. She said she hadn't fully understood what the document meant. She said Warren had explained it as a procedural thing, a Hearst family standard. She said she should have asked more questions. I believed her. I also knew that part of not asking questions is not wanting to know the answer. Joanna knew, not the details, but some part of her had known that something wasn't sitting right, and she had chosen, for a time, the comfort of not looking directly at it. We are all capable of that. I have done it too. We talked for a long time that day. The kind of talking we hadn't done in a while. Honest and slow, and sometimes uncomfortable. She asked me about her father, about what I had found out, about whether I was angry. I told her I wasn't angry at Leonard. He had been protecting something for us and ran out of time to explain it. That was grief's timing, not his intention. She asked if I was angry at her. I thought about the restaurant, about she means well, about all the Sunday calls that got shorter and shorter while Pauline's orbit got larger. I said, I was hurt. That's different from angry. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, I forgot who taught me what mattered. She said it the way people say things when they finally understand them. Not to be poetic. Because it was simply true. The legal matters took several months to resolve. Douglas was thorough and patient, and occasionally very funny in a dry Sudbury solicitor way that I appreciated. Franklin Reeves' documentation was exact. The outcome was not in question, ultimately. The partnership interest was mine. What I did with it was my own decision. I didn't need a large sum of money. I am not a person who knows what to do with a large sum of money. I have a small apartment, a manageable life, a cat named after a hockey player that Joanna gave me 3 Christmases ago, but I did know what Leonard would have wanted done with it, and I knew what I wanted. I established a fund through the Sudbury Community Foundation for older women facing housing instability, specifically widows and single mothers navigating financial uncertainty alone. The kind of women I had been. The kind of women no one thinks about until they need something. The fund was named the Leonard Oakes Memorial Bursary. That was the only thing I was certain about from the beginning. When I told Joanna, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Dad would have liked that. I said, I know. She asked if she could be involved. Not Warren, not Pauline, her. I said yes. As for Pauline, she called me once, about 2 months after everything became official. Her voice was different on the phone. Smaller, somehow. She said she wanted me to know that she had not been fully aware of all the implications. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, Pauline, I don't have hard feelings. I have clarity now. That's better. She didn't seem to know what to do with that answer. We said goodbye politely, and I haven't heard from her since. Warren is still my son-in-law. He is still pleasant and well-dressed. He is also, I think, genuinely trying to understand what he participated in, even if he's not entirely sure how to say so yet. Some people arrive at accountability sideways and slowly. I've learned to have patience for that. Joanna and I talk on Sundays again. For longer now. Sometimes she drives down to Sudbury, and we make dinner together the way we used to. Last month she arrived with groceries and stayed an entire weekend. We watched old movies and disagreed about which one was better. And it was the most ordinary thing in the world, which meant it was everything. She told me once, not long ago, that she had felt for a while like she was finally becoming someone important. That the Hearst world had made her feel like she was moving up into something. She said she hadn't realized that what she was actually moving away from was herself. I told her I understood that. I told her the pull of that feeling is very real and not something to be ashamed of. She said, I should have protected you. I said, you should have protected yourself first. Then we both could have been fine. There is no dramatic ending to this story. No grand courtroom moment, no public reversal. Just a series of quiet reckonings and the slow work of rebuilding something that was worth keeping. I still talk to Douglas occasionally. He retired properly last year, but sends a card at Christmas and once mailed me a news clipping about a heritage property in Sudbury that he thought I'd find interesting, because it mentioned Leonard's old firm. I have it on the refrigerator next to Joanna's most recent photo. I think about Leonard often. Not with sadness anymore, mostly. With something that feels closer to gratitude. He was a man who kept careful records and loved his family quietly, and ran out of time before he could finish explaining himself. I understand that now without bitterness. He didn't leave me wealth. He left me documentation of something true. In the end, that turned out to be enough. If this story has stayed with you, I'd be glad to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to protect something quietly, without knowing if anyone would understand? Have you ever been the person in the room that others decided didn't need to know? Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. And if you feel like staying with us, there are more stories ahead. The quiet ones, honest ones, the kind that take a while to tell because they took a while to live.